Just outside Little Rock, Arkansas, a family is grieving the loss of a 17-year-old. Now, this story definitely did not make national headlines until Al Sharpton and attorney Ben Crump decided to take it on. The only thing that makes this case extremely different than other cases of police killings is the fact that in this case, the victim is white. And it is an interesting step for the duo, who has been traveling all across the country for really the last decade, representing different families. Now, in this case with a 17-year-old Hunter Britton, his family says he was shot and killed by a sheriff's deputy, and that individual was not fired for killing him. 8 days after his death, he was actually fired for failing to comply with the department's body camera policy. I want you to take a listen to what Sharpton had to say as to why he decided to take this case on.
The issue of policing is not about black and white. It's about right and wrong. I do know that the purpose of having body cameras is not to turn them on after you shoot. If you had enough time to decide to shoot, you had enough time to turn on the body camera and show us what you were shooting about.
Now, today, 156 white people have actually been killed by police in comparison to 102 black people. But even though the numbers are skewed there, when you think about the portion of the population, white people make up about 76% of the country's population, whereas black people only make up about 14%. So it's very disproportionate. I want to bring in Brother Mac and Ben Dixon on this. You know, it's very interesting to see Crump and Sharpton, who have been leading on this issue. Now, all of a sudden, it looks like they are pivoting on their strategy. Do you think it will be effective?
You know, Georgia, I think the thing in looking at this situation, what we have to be cognizant of, and I think it's fair, is that these families reached out to Crump and Sharpton and invited them to participate in trying to bring about justice for the loss of their child. So I think that is the ultimate part. And I can say to you that when I served as chief servant of the Seattle-King County NAACP, my philosophy was always that I was fighting for right, not black right. I didn't understand black right or white right. I only understood right. So from that perspective, I had cases where white folks came to me asking for the help of the NAACP. And in that of fighting for justice, I absolutely would take their case if I found that their case had merit and their civil rights were being violated. So, you know, being in a situation like Crump and Sharpton, where they're fighting for, quote, justice, if a white family were to reach out to them, I don't know how they would refuse that family to say, no, we're not going to take your case. The only cases we're going to take are cases that involve the loss of black lives. So from that perspective, because the family reached out to them, and as Sharpton said, in his 40 years of being on the civil rights battlefield, this is one of the first times that a white family reached out to them to say, can you please help us?
Well, and I think that it speaks widely to the legislation that they've been trying to get passed, to say that this is not a bill that is exclusive for black people. This is a bill for all Americans, because all Americans are being impacted by this. And in fact, and this has been debated a lot of times when we're talking about police accountability, and you get people who are saying that officers are just doing their job. One of the things we heard even Ben Shapiro say this, that more white people are being killed by police. But it made me ask myself this question. You know, here you have Hunter Britton, a 17-year-old kid. He was out driving with his friend. His friend actually witnessed his death. Something was wrong with his car. So he gets out of the vehicle. And he, I guess, in order to get the car to go into park, he had to put something under the tire. And so something's wrong with the car. He can't get it to go into park. So he gets out of the car during the traffic stop to put, I think it was like an old oil can or something underneath the tire to prevent it from rolling back into the sheriff's car. He's like trying to keep the sheriff safe. The sheriff didn't ask questions, didn't make any demands, and just from what I've been told from the reports I've read, just shot him and killed him. And so when you look at Hunter Britton and you look at all the other white people in this country who have been killed by law enforcement, the other question that I have is, what is it that's happening within the white community where they're not having the same response as the black community is to these what most call state-sanctioned deaths? Yeah. Why is it that the white community is not outraged, is not taking to the street to protest, is not going down to the police station, city hall? Like, it feels almost in a sense that a lot of people who have been impacted in the white community by this issue are complicit.
I think you're going to find that to be the case because for so many people, you mentioned Ben Shapiro earlier, for many people like Ben Shapiro or Tucker Carlson, Republicans in general, Donald Trump, conservatives, they would rather have the talking point that more white people are killed than black people as a means of undermining our fight for black lives. In other words, there's a certain level of casualties that they're prepared to endure on the white side of the equation, as evidenced by every single time a black life is killed. The first thing they say is that, oh, well, more white people are killed. Well, OK, that's fine. What are you going to do about it? And I'm so glad to see these families reach out to Al Sharpton and Benjamin Crump, because it is a bigger problem than just black lives. The real question is why have white people been putting up with the police state shooting and gunning them down? I'm reminded of Daniel Shaver. One of the worst police shootings I've ever seen in my life. A white man, I believe he was 27 years old, in a hotel lobby or in a hotel hallway, crawling on his hands and knees. A white man begging, crying, pleading for his life. And the officer was playing Simon Says with his life and ultimately killed him. At that point, when I saw that there was no response from the white community, I realized that for so many of them, not all of them, but for a lot of them, it's merely a talking point and they don't honestly care about the lives because it's more important for them to leverage those lives against those white lives against black lives.
You know, and Ben, you know, going back to, well, let's first go back to Sharpton's statement. This is not about black lives or white lives, but police misconduct. I would take issue with that. You know, I clearly think what has taken place in our community has been about black lives. You know, so I think that, you know, had I saw his words prior to that, you know, and far be it from me or anybody else to put words in Reverend Sharpton's mouth. Because I got a tremendous amount of respect for him. I think as a lot of us do because of his body of work of being on that battlefield. But I certainly think that can be misconstrued and it can begin to direct this to basically lower the cry of Black Lives Matter. I clearly still believe that what happens with police actions when they confront black folk is about the fact that they do not value our lives. So, you know, if he would have said, you know, this is an example of police misconduct that crosses all races, I could agree with that. But to say that this is not about black lives, not about white lives, no, I disagree with that. Respectfully disagree with that, Brother Sharpton. And being to your case about Daniel Shavers, you know, what I want us to understand about this system, this young man was murdered in January of 2016, March of 2016, and it's Maricopa County in Arizona. Now, he's from Texas, and this is a La Quinta Inn in the hallway. So come March, early March, now they file charges. Once they file charges, then the police department decides to fire him, but they don't fire him based on the shooting. They fired him because engraved on his weapon, he had, and let me say this, you are, quote, F, but F was spelled out. He also had a Greek slogan on there, and that Greek slogan was Milan Laba, which means come and take him. Prior to that case, there was an internal investigation about a young man during an arrest that he body slammed. And as a result of the internal investigation, the police said, and this happened prior to this shooting of Daniel Shaver, which I agree with you was one of the most chilling pieces of footage that I've ever seen. And I'm not saying it was the most chilling in comparison to some of the footage that we've seen in the taking of Black lives. It was chilling because this footage that I saw drug out for, God, I don't know, 5 or so minutes, and you're listening to it and you're just like, there's no way he's going to shoot this kid because he's simply complying to everything he's saying, hands up, the lights. But basically what happens is they clear him, a jury clears him of second-degree murder in December of 2017. Then the Department of Justice comes in March of 2018 and see if there's some civil rights violations. But during this time, they now rehire Brailsford back. He works for 42 days in order for him to get all of his medical paid, to get his $2,500 a month pension. The cop who was with him, who was also barking out orders, now he retires and moves to the Philippines. And Brailsford today is now in Glensdale, Arizona, working. So to think that you could have looked at something so chilling and they did nothing about it, it is incredible. But when you go back to Brother Sharpton and Brother Crump and what they're doing, again, I absolutely understand, because the family said, look, obviously, you're not going to convince me that they're the only attorneys dealing with this. I got to believe that there's a plethora of white attorneys dealing with this. But they're recognizing that these two brothers are two of the best in the game as far as trying to bring justice. And if I'm hurt, I don't care what your race, nationality is, if you can help heal this hurt and bring justice to my child being murdered, I'm going to reach out to you. And of all places, in Arizona, I was just shocked to hear that this took place in Arizona and that these white folks said, we are going to reach out to them. So on a bigger scale, clearly, now you're getting to take a look at the corruption and just how rotten this system of police is internally, that they will cover up from each other, regardless of what the circumstances are. Now, going back to what happened to this young man, his friend also talked about the fact that their vehicle was having transmission issues. So it was they were having a difficult time placing it in park. So when they were stopped, that's when he got out with the container, trying to place it under the back wheel so that the vehicle would not roll back into the officer. And as you stated, Georgia, now the officer, without warning, without anything, pulls out his gun, according to the friend that was riding with the young man, and said that the officer shot and killed, and again turned his body cam off so that you could not see, and for all of us to get a clear view of what happened. But there's a lot of layers to, when we have this issue of discussing now white folks who, as you stated, don't appear holistically to come out. But I think it may be because they have not witnessed or experienced this over centuries that we as Black folks have experienced with law enforcement.
Yeah. And I think that you brought out some parallels that we've seen in other cases. I want to take a listen to this clip. Devin Jacob is one of the co-counsels who's going to be helping attorney Ben Crump prosecute this case out of a suburb that's near Little Rock. Take a listen to what Devin Jacob, the co-counsel, had to say.
Policing in America is sick. That's a fact. And I'm a former police officer. And the illness shows itself with different symptoms. And sometimes those symptoms are racism. But other times the symptoms that we need to treat are when a deputy is fired for not turning on his body camera instead of fired for shooting an unarmed 17-year-old.
And I think right there, he got to the heart of what is wrong with accountability in the policing profession. Because there you have it, even when there is accountability, even in this case of Hunter Britton, 17-year-old, who was killed, he his family didn't get accountability because he was killed. He got accountability because the sheriff failed to turn on his body camera. And it reminds me of Breonna Taylor, where you see that there were charges brought for endangering neighbors or, putting holes in the wall, but not for taking her life. And so often when you do see accountability, it is almost a slap in the face. Could you imagine that being your 17-year-old son and knowing that the person who killed him was not held accountable for his death, but for violating a policy? So had that sheriff have turned on his body camera, he would still have a job most likely. And that's a hard pill to swallow. That's a hard pill to swallow. I think about how significant this could be for the broader issue, because yes, while many white families do not reach out to Crump and Sharpton to come in on these cases, the fact that they decided to take this case on, I think is significant. They have been advocating for more than a year for the George Floyd Policing Act to be passed, and it's been hung up in the Senate. And so if America, Black America, white America, can unite on this issue, it may give the nation the leverage that it needs to move forth with change, with tangible change. Because so far to date, only organizing around the cases, only representing the cases of Black families, regardless of how heinous the act is, like we saw with George Floyd, it's not enough. It's still not enough. And so when I saw this, I was like, I just raised the eyebrow at it at first. But when I really listened to what Crump and Sharpton had to say, yes, they want to see policing change in America. And I think that they're at a point in this fight where they realize they are going to have to do it together with white Americans.
Yeah.
George, I want to say this. There's levels of where I can appreciate what the former officer said. But again, if you're going to speak truth to power, if you're going to say that, say it right. Don't say sometimes racism is, and then sometimes it's about a body cam. No. In the case of Black folk, we can, if you take a look at these cases, you can clearly see that it's about racism at every level when it comes to law enforcement, up to and including the judge. Even now in this case of Philip Bradford that murdered Daniel Shaver, when they brought him back, they allowed him to claim disability. So they paid for his medical expenses, saying he suffered from post-stress traumatic syndrome. Go back to the George Floyd case. Now the judge in that case is saying that the children who witnessed this, and he referred to our children, our girls, as young women. See, those little phrases and buzzwords, we have to be extremely critical of the language that they use. These were not young women. They were children. Right. And now he says, well, I don't see any, and when it came to sentencing Chauvin, part of that sentencing was the dramatic, horrific impact that it would have had on these children. And instead of viewing them as children, the judge viewed them as, quote, young women. They're not young women, they're children. So in this case, the judge in the Chauvin case does not look at our children as having a mental devastating impact that they witnessed. But in the case of Philip Brailsford, who murders Daniel Shaver, you can understand the psychological impact that it would have had on him. And now you rehire him, pay him full medical benefits, and allow him to have a pension. Our soldiers who work to defend this country, science has proven that there is a mental disorder, the stress disorder that is heaped upon them. But when it comes to Black folk, Black children, you don't see us that way. And so I would take issue with the former police officer. I can appreciate what you said, but if you're going to say it in a fact that, we speak truth to power. It's not sometimes racism comes into play. In this case, when they stop our children, they don't see us even as humans, which is why they continue to do these types of nefarious acts against our people. So as much as I can appreciate what he said, say it for what it is. Don't tell me sometimes racism. No, call it when you see it. And in every one of these cases, that's the way I see it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and only thing I wanted to add to that, Georgia, is the fact that this knowledge, the situation is well known to white America, to the criminal justice system. They're not unaware of what they're doing to human lives. They're not unaware of what they're doing to black lives specifically. But it is a game of power. And one of the reasons why they are so willing to ignore white lives as they are killed by police officers is because if they peradventure happen to address how many white folks are killed by police officers, you cannot do that without looking at the structural, systemic racism as it pertains to how black lives are killed. So it's necessary for them to ignore white casualties of this police war against black lives.
Well, and before we wrap here, I want to take a listen to what Crump had to say. A lot of people have started to dub him as the Attorney General of Black America. And so I thought it was equally significant that he decided to represent this case as well. Take a listen to what he had to say about it.
Then we have to make sure that it's not swept under the rug. Right. And we have to help give a voice to them, just like we gave a voice to George Floyd's family.
And so there, he is talking about giving a voice to the voiceless. And the thing that I've learned, I've interviewed over 20 mothers whose children were killed by police in more than a dozen states. And the thing that I learned is it didn't matter what their race was. It didn't matter what economic class they were in. It didn't matter if they were from this country or not. They all had a similar experience. And the reality of it is, if you find yourself on that side of the equation, that your voice is largely taken. It's very difficult to get the media to really represent your viewpoint and your thought, because the media has been trained to regurgitate facts that are sent out by police. Families who have lost a loved one to police also often express that they feel that they're being followed, different acts of intimidation. I remember one fiance who had lost her partner was holding a protest, and the officer who signed off on the report in her partner's death was assigned to work patrol at her protest. And so, it's those small things that we hear from families. So for Crump to say that he wanted to give a voice to this family, I felt like it was very powerful. But in thinking about all of this, right? Like, some people, they say, like, this isn't even newsworthy. Crump and Sharpton, they're taking their first case of, a white teen being killed. Like, maybe they should have been doing this. But what it makes me ask myself, you guys, where would we be today if every single time, when you look at those numbers, 156 white people to date have been killed by police in comparison to 102 black people. If every single time a white citizen was killed by police, if white Americans came out and showed the same level of care and compassion for the humanity that had been taken as what we've seen in the Black Lives Matter movement, where would we be today? If white Americans, every single time a white person was killed by police, they went to their local police department, they went to the governor's office, where would we be today? Would we have the change? Would there have been legislation in place, but even before George Floyd? If white Americans prioritize this issue, those specifically who have been affected by this issue, if they stood up and they advocated for change on this issue, would we already have a bill passed? That's what this has made me think about. It's made me realize that this is an issue largely for the last decade that has been prioritized by Black community leaders, Black politicians, Black faith leaders who have they've exhausted all of their political and social capital trying to make change on this issue, yet and still as many allies as we think we have, or even looking at the numbers, the fact that this is actually an issue statistically that impacts more white people, yet and still they're not showing up. They're not showing up to the fight. But where would we be if they did, or if they chose to 10 years ago?
Well, Georgia, let me add this. I don't question that so much, because let's go back to school shootings in this country. Columbine, Sandy Hook, right? Now it's where the capitalism comes into play, the politics of it all. Most of these school shootings are white children shooting white children, and yet, or white folks shooting white folks, but nonetheless killing and shooting children. And even that horrific situation has not moved Congress to gun legislation. Why? Because it's about power. They know that the influence of the NRA, the people that follow the NRA. And so even in that situation, they can't, they haven't seemed to come up with a reasonable solution for gun legislation. Now, I think that, going back to Crump and Sharpton and taking this case, without question, this country has looked at, I know when I grew up as a child and they brought law enforcement officers to us on career day, the police were introduced as, quote, officer friendly, right? And so now, by taking situations like this, we as Black folks in our community, we always say, many times we'll say, if that were, by them taking this case, we finna take the if out of these situations, because in the case of Daniel Shaver, I remember reading where his loved one said, if he were Black and the Black Lives Matter movement was behind this, we would have received justice for our loved one. They didn't. In the case of Hunter, if he were Black, so by Sharpton and Brother Crump taking this case, it's going to take the if out of that situation, and it is going to make America look at this incredible, sick system of law enforcement, how rotten it is internally, and see how they protect themselves against whatever it is they do, and remove this thing of qualified immunity to begin to hold them accountable. So the beauty of what these brothers have done is that they're keeping their eyes on the real situation. Is not that real isn't Black Lives Matter, but this situation of just how absolutely rotten this system of law enforcement is into this country. So, we also have to show sympathy, because again, Georgia, as you stated, regardless, we have to realize that this family in Arkansas, they just lost a child. The family from Texas, in the case of Shaver, they lost a loved one. And those accountability and justice should be given to these folks. So I certainly applaud Crump and Crump and Sharpton for certainly taking this case, because it's going to make America look at this law enforcement. But again, when I think about school shootings and them looking at that and haven't done anything about it, trust and believe, family, this struggle will continue. We got a long road ahead of us.
Absolutely. Well, that is all that we have time for this morning. Thank you all for joining us, and stay around for more on The Benjamin Dixon Show.